Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium. Today is Friday, May 16th, 2025, and I'm Diane Sayre, President of the LaRouche Organization. Today has been an historic day in that there were finally talks of a sort between the Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Istanbul. And these came about, in case people don't remember, at the initiative of President Putin, after having had bilateral meetings with 23 heads of state and government over the weekend where they were having the Victory Day parade celebrating the 80-year anniversary of the defeat of the Nazis. And the British were trying to create, in effect, a trap by insisting there had to be a 30-day truce. And unfortunately, President Donald Trump had begun to echo that. Putin, at a 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning Moscow time press conference, initiated talks in Turkey, saying, why don't we pick up where we left off in 2022? For those of you who don't know, just a few weeks, basically 3 weeks after the Russians began their special military operation on February 24th, 2022, Turkey had organized talks between a Russian and Ukrainian delegation that would have ended the hostilities right then and there. It was something like 116 pages. Every page had been initialed. It was ready to go. Ukraine would have given up Crimea, which had voted to rejoin the Russian Federation, but they would not have lost anything else. They would have agreed not to join NATO, to remain neutral. And what happened was, people tend to forget this, but one of the Ukrainian negotiators was brutally assassinated coming home from that. And then Boris Johnson, then the British Prime Minister, flew over there on his jet and told Zelensky, no, 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 you keep fighting, we will arm you, you keep fighting. So President Trump, who ran for president very much on a platform of ending this war, which has claimed the lives of over 1 million people, over 1 million Ukrainian soldiers, and some 200, 300,000 Russian soldiers. It's been really devastating and deadly, could be brought to an end. Biden, for his part, after the Trump election victory, started sending Ukraine long-range missiles and giving them permission to strike targets deep inside Russia. That was the most terrifying part of the transition. And luckily, President Putin is a judo expert and seems to have nerves of steel. He did not react, and happily, Trump is doing no such thing, but it's not clear to me that he understands what he is dealing with. And what I mean is that his comments, for this to end, I'm going to have to talk to Putin, is really not the right way to talk to the president of the Russian Federation, which for all intents and purposes has won this war. Ukraine has been defeated. Russia is going to dictate the terms. The United States is not going to dictate the terms. And as Scott Ritter said on the International Peace Coalition call earlier today, which everyone should listen to, it was a remarkable dialogue. He said what the United States now should do is to pressure Zelensky and the Europeans that they are going to have to concede to what Russia is saying in terms of the oblasts that also voted to join the Russian Federation. That is not just Luhansk and Donetsk, but Kherson and Zaporozhye. And of course, Zelensky's saying no. But at any rate, somehow with all of this chaos and confusion, they did manage to hold 2 hours of meetings today, delayed 1 day by Zelensky's shenanigans and the Ukrainian delegation. The Russians were there waiting. Contrary to Zelensky's outrageous claims that Russia sent a low-level delegation, which has been parroted in the US press, one of the members of the Russian delegation, Mr. Medinsky, actually was in the first round of talks 3 years ago in Turkey, and he is, in a sense, deputized by President Putin to represent him in the same way that Steve Witkoff has been deputized by President Trump. That's about as high level as you can get without getting the actual heads of state. So Russia sent a very high-level delegation with the complete authority to negotiate. The Ukrainians diddled around, showed up a day late, very disrespectfully. Then Zelensky accused Putin of being disrespectful. So I'm just giving some background to give you the sense, after all of this, there was indeed a meeting which lasted only 2 hours. They agreed on a release of 1,000 prisoners on each side. They agreed to future talks. Scott had reported earlier that there was some talk of Putin and Trump having a phone call this evening. I haven't heard more about it, and we'll see. But I think unless it is clear that President Trump actually has a full understanding of the situation on the ground, I don't know that Putin would find it terribly productive for the two of them to talk right now. The United States has to play a role not in telling President Putin what to do, but in getting Zelensky to back down, our little kept monster, which he has been only too willing to serve as the aggressor in this. So it's a bit of progress. It is significant. I don't know what will happen between now and the next round of talks. We will see. And again, I would really recommend listening to the IPC call that occurred today at 11 a.m. It's available on the Schiller Institute YouTube channel. Otherwise, we have absolutely hideous starvation in Gaza, where 20% of the population there is now at stage 5, basically starvation, famine, and death, and the other 80% of the population there is at stage 4. You're going to have massive deaths of starvation unless the Israeli blockade is not ended. President mentioned something about that today, saying the U.S. was going to address it and, quote, "we'll do a good job." If he's talking about this crazy conglomerate of private contractors under the control of Israel to do it, this is not going to be a good job. We should be using the UN Relief Works Agency, which had already 400 distribution sites in Gaza that would be capable of delivering the amount of food and medical supplies and other supplies, humanitarian aid, as quickly as possible. And there are thousands of trucks waiting at the border crossings to bring this aid in. But of course, you also would have to have a ceasefire to do that. Now, President Trump could end this genocide in one short phone call with Bibi Netanyahu. I understand that he's not particularly keen to speak with Netanyahu, and I don't blame him. But in this case, the United States should wield its authority. So with all of that going on, we now are going to come back to the United States, because something that is not even really discussed anywhere is the fact that our economy is in a shambles. We're not in a recovery. There is no evidence, as I've said before, that anyone on the President Trump team has a clue of how to solve the problem of rebuilding our industrial base, of restoring a reasonable standard of living to the American people, where if you wanted to, one person working 40 hours a week could support a family of 4 or 5, and the spouse could stay home looking after the children and taking care of other things on the home front. That used to be the standard in the United States in the 60s and the 70s. Now, as people know, you need 2, 3, 4, 5 jobs. People are working 80 hours a week to try and make ends meet, and they still can't afford to buy a house. And even if you do buy a house, chances are it's a tar paper shack. It's disintegrating at touch. The roads that you drive on to get there are filled with potholes. Your child's school is teaching bizarre subjects, and it's just really not going so well. So this can be addressed. One of the last things that Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 2014 was he called it the 4 laws, and for an urgent action, it's a necessity, not an option. And my guest, Richard Freeman, is an economics researcher with Executive Intelligence Review, also a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, and he has created an approach to look at how do we solve this problem, how do we create actually a spectacular recovery in the United States, and what will be the drivers. So welcome, Rich. I'm glad to have you here, and I'm eager to hear what you have to say.
Great. And thank you, Diane. I'm always excited to be on the show. It's a very good show. Just one small intelligence correction. It's reported that Boris Johnson did not fly over by plane, but a number of people spotted a broom in the sky with Boris Johnson on it. And that may be the way he got over to talk to Zelensky. But in any event, this is a proposal that has been made, written up for our executive committee, and it's being already. I've gotten responses, some very detailed ones and excellent ones, to think about what we're going to do to deal with the United States economy. And so, if I could have the first slide, this has the rather ponderous name, but it's called the Crash Mobilization for 8 Crucial Transformative Projects to Create an Economic Shockwave Recovery. And that's what the idea is. Now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to say what these projects are, but I also simultaneously want to address the method by which we're going to do this. There are many, well, let me just say what the first transformative. It's 1 change in policy and 7 science drivers. And the science drivers in this change in policy are what would be top-down used to organize the U.S. economy and then change it entirely. The change in policy is very fundamental. United States recognizes that we are one humanity. That's the change in policy. It means we join with Russia, China, the BRICS, various other groups associated with that, and to craft a new world development and security architecture, which is already coming into existence, whatever the United States is doing or not doing. But we should consciously, as a policy, do that. If we do, and we use a Hamiltonian credit system, which I will describe very briefly at the end, we will start producing goods production for the creation in the global majority nations, 85% of the world's population, water management systems, health and hospital systems, power generation systems, advanced capital goods, high-speed rail systems, ports and canals. And as my colleague Dennis Speed pointed out, we're going to be building whole cities, not just these things, but they will be part of entire cities and entire zones that you think about in Africa, in Ibero-America, in parts of Asia. And as we build those, we will produce far more of use for the U.S. economy than we will get by any one of 10 or 20 policies that Trump has proposed for tariffs or non-tariffs this week, some tariffs next week, and so forth. Because this will allow us to open up about 50,000, along with the other things I'm about to discuss, about 50,000 manufacturing plants that have been closed or transform them, convert them, some of them being war production plants, that would be therefore transformed to produce this array of goods that I've just spoken about. That will bring back about 10 million workers. And that's the sort of, well, that first phase, probably about 3 to 4 million, but that's the phase that we need to do it, but it's an openness of mind. Next one, please. So what I'd like to do, I'm sorry, 2 after that. Let me just list what these plants, next one, please. Okay, I hope this can be seen. This is the packages that I think we should address, and we'll see why in a second. Constructing the North American Water and Power Alliance, which is a 4,000-mile long interbasin water project, building 42,000 miles of new electrified high-speed rail, including maglev rail, covering the continental U.S., but extending down to the tip of Ibero-America and passing by a Bering Strait tunnel to Eurasia, and then on to Africa. Constructing 130 new nuclear power plants, possessing 130 gigawatts of installed capacity, using Generation 4 reactors. Advancing space exploration and colonization focused on a Moon-Mars mission, based on the fundamental ideas of space pioneer Kraft Erika and Lyndon LaRouche, including fusion-powered rockets. Accelerated development of commercial fusion power, employing tokamak, stellarator, and all the different methods for doing it. Constructing 10 to 12 brand new American cities, capable of sustaining 3 to 6 million people. If it's 12 cities, 12 times 3 is 36 million people. If it's 6 million and they build up to that, that's 72 million people. And I'll show where that would be. And then the use of optical biophysics for medical treatment. And the question you might say is, well, why did I pick 7? Why didn't I pick 20? Why didn't I pick 3? And also, we have hundreds of projects to be built. Shouldn't we be building those? And I'm going to show that we will. But you have to think about something in terms of economics. And the point about this is that you want a science-intense, knowledge-intense approach. If we fix all the highways in America, and we will, that will not even get us out of the stagnation which Diane suggested that we have, which we do. It simply won't. So you'll have to point your economy and where you put your priorities to creating what LaRouche calls an economic shockwave. And it's a method. And if you adopt the right method, you will succeed. And if you don't adopt this method, and the only one I know of is the one we're putting forward right here, based on Lyndon LaRouche's economics, then we will transform America. So let me just do a couple of quotes, if we can go back up, Dave, to the quotes, because it's important before going through the projects, just to say what LaRouche thought. One more back up, please. So this is something from a paper that LaRouche wrote, and he talks about how he came to certain ideas of, how you develop an economy. So he said, the activity, I don't have that many quotes, but this is one of them. The activity of the Platonic hypothesis, that axiomatic revolutionary activity compared with the resulting change in man's per capita power over nature, is the phenomenon to which all rational employment of the term knowledge is referenced. This may be striking to all of you that this is how knowledge is, but it is. It is not the observed relations among sense phenomena, which is a subject of knowledge. The proximate subject of knowledge is the changes in sensory phenomena, patterns of behavior, which have been, are being affected cumulatively, historically, through the creative faculty of hypothesis generation. It is a relationship of such changes to increases in potential population density and to man's breaking through barriers of technology to make richly habitable the deserts or barren planets beyond our own, such as Mars, which test historically to present date those adducible principles of higher hypothesis, which are just shown to be the most reliable known choices of guides to truth respecting man's relationship to nature. And then the next slide, please. All along, there are certain virtually absolute social truths with a moral force of natural law embedded in the cumulative evidence of historically successful Platonic higher hypothesis. One simple illustration, and there's much, much rich stuff that Lynn has done on this, so I'm not going to try and do it in 30 seconds. Think of what Fermat looked at. Everyone could see that when light enters the medium from a light to water, it bends. And Jason Ross gave an excellent and fun-filled class on, what Descartes thought this was, which is someone was standing there with a tennis racket, beating down the rays so that they would bend. But What happened was he tested an hypothesis that refraction, going from one medium to another, had a certain principle. It's actually related to the sign of the two angles, the angle of incidence to the sign of refraction. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing was he hypothesized that this was a feature of nature, that nature was built such a way that this would happen. You might call that metaphysical. It's not. It's the least action principle. And then by looking at each successive hypothesis of revolutionary discovery principles, you start to hypothesize what is the principle by which each one of these scientists or musicians who make cultural breakthroughs hypothesized and what was going on in their minds and the stage by which they overthrew previous existing ideas which were accepted for centuries, and using the principle of metaphor and irony brought in higher ideas. You think of that whole process. That's what we're looking for to change in the American population so that we can then produce this revolution that we're talking about. Now, LaRouche pointed this to a shockwave, an economic shockwave. Now, that may not be a familiar phrase. Some people may know it, some people may not. If we can have the next slide, please. We have a very brief quote. The first quote was, by the way, from LaRouche's 1993 paper on his fundamental discovery that he made in 1948 through 52. And this one says, therefore, we must define per capita potential of entire societies in terms of a self-reflexive potential function, potential relative population density, and must interpret the leaps in potential as elaborated in a manner analogous to shockwave propagation. In other words, taking division of labor and kilowatt hours as an integrated conception of the constraints of the process of rising per capita potential to whole societies, we must treat the actions linking one level to the next as occurring in a shockwave-like manner. Societies grow through shockwaves. It's the only way they do grow. It's the only way economies grow. They don't grow through accretions of small little changes. They may be necessary to fill in the potholes, to keep a society from total collapse. But the advancement is through shockwaves, which we deliberatively, to the hypothesis of higher hypothesis, create for our economy, which means we orient the social surplus we have, the free energy, to investing in those. I picked 7, I'm sure we'll expand it. Those 7 which will make a difference. And what we will do, and I will show you, is in the generation, we will create an economy that has 2 to 3 times the power, 2 to 3 times the advanced scientific capabilities, 3 to 5 times the potential relative population density, which can be achieved in no other way than the way that we're going to look at it right now. And so that's why we're recommending this. We will then bring in the hundreds of projects, which when we increase the productivity of the economy as a whole, will have its effect. Last point before reviewing. When you look at something, do not look at the point of production where something is produced. That doesn't give you value at all. The Marxists are nuts. I mean, they try and do something useful once in a while. But the idea of labor time has no connection. Let's say you built a canoe and you spent 1,000 hours building a canoe out of wood, and you wanted to transport modern goods, which are measured in TEUs. The thing would sink. So it's not the amount of labor time. Everything is determined by how it moves forward, the higher process of the higher manifold of the economy as a whole. That's where value comes from. It doesn't come from local. It comes from the process as a whole. So now we're going to take a look quickly, and I'll try and just touch on a few of these features of what these 7 projects would do. So the first one is the North American water power lines. We'll skip that for now. And people have heard of this before, but I want you to conceive of this from a new light. Because if you have one revolutionary process, what happens if you introduce 7 revolutionary processes at the same time interacting with one another, in which they change the manifold? Every time you change a manifold of thought, It's not like you're replacing something and putting something in the place of the old thing. You're putting in a new Cantorian organizing principle. That's what we're going to do. So this is the original Nawapa Prime. It was produced by Parsons Engineering. You can see Parsons at the bottom, and you can see if you on your screen, it starts up near Alaska, in the very northernmost part of Alaska, and goes all the way down south into the United States, into the areas around Nevada and Utah and so forth. Next one, please. And what was planned to go into Ibero-America, to Mexico. Next one. This is our version of it. It's tilted on its side, but it's still the same thing. And you'll now see that it goes all the way into Sonora. This project is 4,000 miles long if you go by land, from the Tenaya and the Yukon River, the rivers up very north of Alaska, all the way down into Sonora. That is 50% larger than any water project in the world. It will also transport 138 million acre feet, which doesn't mean much to most people because people don't think in terms of acre feet. But what I will say is that that's about 170 billion cubic meters of water per year. The magnificent North-South water project in China is about 44.8 billion. So this is easily 4 to 5 times greater. If we build this, this is the largest water project in the world that will ever have been constructed. And we can do it. I will just emphasize a couple of points. Next, please. Okay, now this shows you may not be able to see it well, but you'll see the darker areas. It's called the Great Basin Desert, the Mojave Desert, the Sonoran Desert, and the Chihuahuan Desert. This is North America. This is a very, very, very big desert. And that's the darkest shading. In the north, you'll see a lighter shading. Half of that lighter shading is semi-arid, which therefore is still very, very dry. I just want to show you where the Great Basin Desert is, if we can go to the next one, so people can conceptualize this. That's the Great Basin Desert. It fills up Nevada, half of Utah, parts of Oregon, parts of Idaho, parts of California, and then you see below it the Mojave Desert. So this, if California is between 25 and 33% desert, if you want to look at what, depending on the source that you're consulting. So it's a gigantic desert area. What would we do? We bring this water down. I won't go through it here. We've described it elsewhere, but there's some fascinating things that we're going to do with it. Two of the things we're going to do with it is that in the northern part of the northwestern part of the North American continent, there, for every 1 million cubic kilometers of water flow, there's 1 million tons of plant life. In the area that we want to bring it down to, which is the Southwest, there's 5.5 million tons of plant life per cubic meter of water flow, 5.5 times more. So we're going to change nature. We're going to say, okay, water, bring it down to where it can do its work, where every drop of water is 5.5 times more productive. Not only that, once you start to bring water on land, that you get a 2.7 to 1 recycling ratio, which means that for every, let's say, gallon of water that is brought onto the inland or on the land, rather than all this water, by the way, would wash off into the Pacific Ocean. That's why we're bringing it down. It's only 11% of all that water. So the remaining 89% can wash off. But when you bring it down, you set up a recycling schedule so that for every gallon that is comes down onto land, it recycles through transvaporation and so forth, and then comes down as precipitation 2.7 times. So you change the weather pattern. We are literally changing the biosphere of an entire continent through this project. Now, the other features of this is we will build a tremendous amount. I'll just mention this. We're going to construct a system that will build 32 reservoirs, 39 concrete line tunnels, 28 hydro and nuclear power plants, 8 pumping stations, 4,515 miles of canals, 95 dams. You can go on and on. This will produce 2 to 3 million jobs in the construction of this. And as we enable cities to grow, as we eliminate drought, as we deal with this transforming that entire portion of the United States, part of Canada, and so forth, and also Mexico, we will produce new ability for agriculture. 20 million irrigated acres will start to happen in America, and smaller amounts in both Canada and elsewhere. Last slide on this one, please. Now, this is a place called the Ogallala Aquifer, and some of you may be familiar with this. This is not on the West Coast. This isn't, it's in Nebraska. It's got Kansas and so forth. Some of the water we're bringing down, we are going to bring to the Ogallala Aquifer and refill it. We're also going to bring it to the Colorado River Basin and refill part of that, where water wars could break out because we have water problems. In all, this will go to 17 states, 1 out of every 3 states. You can just get the magnificence in scope. Space exploration. There's much more to say on this, but I just... So next one, please, David. Okay. So LaRouche has talked about for many times a Moon-Mars project, and Diane sent me a really excellent paper that Lynn wrote of why going to Mars, which I only mentioned that we don't have a place to incorporate everything. But LaRouche said why we should go to Mars. And I know people say, I know why, but let me just quote you him. We know how, this is from a paper called, appropriately enough, Why Do We Go to Mars? Just in case you were wondering about that. This is LaRouche. We know we have to go develop the moon, which is accessible to us readily with technology already developed by us. We know we can develop an industry on the moon because you don't want to take off from Earth and lug a lot of things up from Earth. There's just too much effort involved. Go to the moon. Take your technology to the moon. Develop industries on the moon. You can build the spacecraft and other things you need to go to Mars. What has been the mission ever since the 1920s, when the landing on the moon was first planned by some people in Germany? That's what he says. This is what has been the mission. But we revived that after the war, and we went in that direction on a program which was not designed to make weapons. It was designed to enable us to go to the moon, and by going to the moon, to be able to go to Mars. Why do we go to Mars? Because it's the nature of man to do so. The nature of man is expressed by the fact that we are not a fixed species with fixed behavior. We are a species that must develop as mankind has developed. Despite all the setbacks, mankind has greatly improved since our first evidence of what mankind was on the planet. Improved through technology, through, next one please, through intellectual development, and stimulated by technology, by improvements in culture, especially classical culture. And the purpose of man is to find his place in the universe. And this coheres with Kraft Erika's 1957 Anthropology of Astronautics, in which he gave the last 2 laws. Second law, not only the Earth, but the entire solar system, and as much of the universe as he can reach under the laws of nature, are man's rightful field of activity. Third law, by expanding through the universe, man fulfills his destiny as an element of life, endowed with the power of reason and wisdom of the moral law within himself. Next one, please. So let's just discuss a couple of features. What you want to do is build a lunar base, a production hub on the moon. And I'm just going to list, without going through them in great detail, some of the features of what you get from working on development of the moon. And there's a fight going on. There's a fight involving people like Elon Musk, who has, I think, a misconception of the space program of going to Mars, which could very seriously affect what the United States does. But if we go to the moon, we create advanced fusion propulsion spacecraft fueled by helium-3 resources. We establish raw materials, intermediate finished goods. We create an Earth-Mars transportation system for people, goods, water, scientific equipment. LaRouche says we may have as many as 100 rockets transporting back and forth between the moon. We're going to have space stations in assembly lines in the vicinity of the moon and also in the vicinity of the Earth and so forth. We're going to develop the production of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. We're going to terraform the moon for food production. We're going to eventually use Mars-centered and moon-centered and Mars-centered astronomy of the solar system. We're going to study geosynchronous and geostationary orbits, discovery of space radiation, weightlessness, and so forth. So that the Moon-Mars project embodies the highest forms of science and every imaginable exploration you could have. Now, LaRouche says in the paper that Diane sent me that what you want to do is to support an environment where you basically control the moon. The question is not to race Mars, to race there and plant the flag and say, we got here first. The point is you control the atmosphere by creating all sorts of projects, monitoring devices, space telescopes, and so forth, so that when you eventually do land on Mars, you've got an entire support network for the existence for life and so forth and so on. On this approach, let me just mention the outlines of it. People may have questions and so forth. There's Elon Musk. Let me just say, for people who keep saying Musk is an idiot, the people he has, like Tom Mueller, are very good in actually making engines. Rocket engines. They've actually made a few of them that are quite good. So that's not the issue. The issue is, how do you look at this? To do this, we need to develop the lunar base. We need to do research, Riemannian research on the moon. Musk has said that he wants to send a space probe to the moon, Mars, by 2026, and land a colony of about 100 people there in 2029 to 2031. And he would replace the Artemis system, which is NASA's system, which is actually a decent system, and their space launch vehicle, the SLS. The problem with that is it's not thinking. You want to use the space exploration for every feature of development of science and investigation of the universe. There are many anomalies we don't know. LaRouche once said that he thought matter, in one of his papers, was simply a fold in the universe. Can we investigate that? Can we find out about that? That's the sort of thing that we want to do. And so therefore, this must be done, or should be done, with working in collaboration with the Chinese, with the Russians, in every possible way. Next ones, I'll do this quickly. This, people have seen, it's an electrified rail system. As I said, we will probably build about 35,000 miles of high-speed rail, 7,000 miles of magnetic levitation. We'll build an additional 2,300 miles that run from Seattle, Washington to Wales, Alaska, go under the Bering Strait, end up in Llewellyn, Russia, and from there across Eurasia to Rotterdam and then down into Africa. This system will replace what we have, which is an inefficient rail system for sure. And it will increase the speeds. The passenger rails will cruise at 150 to 186 miles per hour. That's about 240 to 300 kilometers per hour. The freight will go from 90 to 100 miles per hour. Both of these speeds will increase the travel time of both freight and people by they will reduce the travel time by 1/2 to 2/3. So electrified rail would allow a manufacturing plant in the U.S. industrial Midwest to produce electric industrial goods in the morning, ship them to the East Coast in the afternoon, where they are completed the same day. The production process is totally redefined. We will also, if we think about it, work on what China has developed, which LaRouche proposed. This is from the August 9th, 2024 South China Morning Post, a maglev hyperloop, which would travel at 621 miles per hour or 1,000 kilometers per hour. That would reduce a trip from New York City to Washington from 4.5 hours to 45 minutes. Maglev involves all sorts of things, like superconductivity, and so forth. But what we will do is unify the world as a single unit from Tierra del Fuego all the way around the world. This then changes the entire world. Fusion power. Next, please. Oh, those are the rail systems that we built that transformed America under Abraham Lincoln from 1865 onward. The principle of building rail corridors is a very well-known principle. Next, for all the advantage you get. Now, this is fusion using helium-3. And so what you see is you have an isotope of deuterium, 1 proton and 1 neutron. This is the fourth one I mentioned in that list of 7. And you have an isotope of helium, which has 2 protons and only 1 neutron. And you bring them together at very high heats. We're talking over 100 million degrees Celsius. Over 15 million degrees Celsius. And you produce a reaction. What do you get from the reaction? Well, you get a normal helium, 2 protons, 2 neutrons. You get a proton, normal hydrogen nucleus, and 18.4 million electron volts. This process is a huge leap in anything mankind has ever done. And this, as LaRouche said in his 4 laws, which Diane referenced earlier, were we to do this, this would increase, it would just get rid of all sorts of needs to meter electricity. You have to achieve 3 things for fusion. You have to have certain densities, confinement densities. You have to have a certain temperature, and you have to have a sustained reaction, and ultimately more output than you put input into the system. Another way of stating that it's self-sustaining. We could use fusion for peaceful nuclear explosions, a plasma field for processing industrial materials and chemicals, generate heat for industrial processes, power rocket ships, as we just discussed, invent a new platform of fusion-related technologies, experimental capabilities, high-powered lasers, particle accelerators, high-temperature plasma generators, directed energy explosions. All of this can be done. In the last number of years, the fusion process, I won't go through it here, as people may know, has been cut. There's exciting work going on in China and Hefei, China, where they're experimental advanced superconducting tokamak. And there's experimental work that's going on in several other places, many of them using plans that the United States first developed in the 1960s and 70s, which we abandoned and have been picked up by other nations. There's much more that can be said about fusion, but I will just take questions and whatever. And people probably know about the Defense Department's or the U.S. Department of Defense National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore Lab, which in February last year took 2.2 megajoules of input of energy and produced 5.2 megajoules or million joules of output. That is ignition. That is what you want. But there are many, many restraints on that. Next one, please, just quickly. This would be fission. And we can just say, which many people know, that the fission process is 5 orders of magnitude greater in energy output than the combustion process, which breaks apart and then reforms chemical bonds, which is what happens with wood and coal and gas and petroleum. Next one, please. Now, what I would suggest is this. We used to have 114 nuclear power plants. Diane knows about Indian Point and other places like that, which are being shut down. We're down to 93. So we've already lost about 17% of our nuclear power plants. All of them are water moderated and water cooled reactors. We should go to the next phase of what are power plants called Generation 4. I will just cite them. I won't go through them. One of them is the thorium salt reactor, molten salt reactor. The Chinese are working on this in the Gobi Desert. There's no water. You don't need water because you use thorium-enriched liquid salt as your primary coolant rather than water. Thorium is far more abundant than nuclear. We also have the pebble bed, which some people are quite familiar with. And we have fast neutron reactors, which I won't go through here, but that's some of the most exciting. I do go through it in the paper if we publish it. how they work, but mostly our reactors are set up, the light water ones. All our nuclear fleet is water moderated, water cooled. They all are set up to create fission in U-235, which is an isotope of uranium. It's less than 1% of all uranium occurring in nature. Even when we enrich it to 3 to 5%, it works on that. Well, what about the uranium which is U-238, which is 95%? That's tossed out as waste. If you use a fast neutron reactor, you can turn that into fuel. In fact, you can create breeder reactors. Next one is the nuklex cities. Now, I suggest these as places where you would build 12 nuklex cities. And you can see there's a star there. This is extraordinarily exciting. You build the city around a 2 to 3 megawatt plant, gigawatt plant, or 2 to 3,000. You build 2 to 3 nuclear plants of 1,000 gigawatts each, which would be a megawatt is a million watts. So it's 1,000 megawatts of 1 gigawatt, a billion watts. The key thing is you use that in agricultural areas to irrigate land, to build water systems, to build anew cities that are brand new. You put their electrical systems, their water systems, their piping underground, and you build them on the models of Florence. You build them culturally beautiful. You build them so that they have a science center where people who are retired can go in the evening and do work on science projects, and they're related to universities and so forth. Next, please. And this is a poor diagram, but nonetheless, it's the nuclear-powered agro-industrial complex. It's called a nuklex, and it shows farm areas that are going to be involved, irrigation lines, nuclear industrial centers, and so forth. Brand new cities that could hold anywhere from 30 to 70 million people and repopulate the United States on an advanced basis. They should be built along the railroad corridors that we're building, the high-speed rail, and along the NWAPA corridors. Those are naturals. And the last thing is called bio-optical or optical biophysics. I don't have a picture of that. This is to say that the body can be tuned to electromagnetic forces, and you can use it for medicine. All sorts of things. It's known, it has a lot of things for diagnostics and for therapeutics. It can be done for a whole range of diseases. And Lyndon LaRouche has called for this for the last 30 to 40 years. He has thought this to be extraordinarily important. I just want to throw out one additional thing. Vaccines are critical because mankind says, how do we defeat disease? We figure out some stuff on vaccines. And that is critical in things, everything from COVID to flu to so forth. But we have on the horizon building specialized vaccines that can deal with individual cancers, so you're not just throwing out something and you're not just using chemotherapy and radiation therapy. And one wonderful article, which I was sent by Jason Ross, is about a 9-year-old, someone who was 4 months old. He had contracted something called CPSI deficiency. It happens in 1 in 1.3 million babies. It's non-treatable. The baby dies. So they used the network that has been developed in the United States, which is a very good network, to work on a protocol, and centers around the United States working into the night to develop something which would splice and replace certain parts of the child's gene program, which they knew where the defective one was. And the child is now 9.5 months old, does not need the injections anymore, and looks like it will survive. We can do that up and down the line. So to conclude, let me just say this. If you take these 7 science programs, and the point about a science program is that it involves all sorts of things we don't know, that we need to know, and you interface them, then your mind and your economy is governed by science. Each one of these would have a tremendous effect on the U.S. economy, a magnificent effect. NWAPA alone, the high-speed rail alone. Put them together, and they will cost, I estimate, somewhere around $3 to $3.5 trillion. That can be done on the budget lines and out of fusion, out of Hamiltonian credit, which I won't go through here. If there's a question, we can go through how you do that. If you do this, the United States economy will be a tremendous system, exceeding even what Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt did, which are the two greatest, in my view, transformations by American system presidents, far exceeding it, and becomes self-sustaining. The last feature, this is all a product of the will and the human mind. It is the human mind that creates the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. It is the human mind that invents scientific discoveries of principles that are already existing in the universe. It is the human mind that sets up self-expanding. And therefore, if you think of one level of potential level relative population density as P1, and the next higher level, maybe having now fusion, maybe having some of these nuclear plants I spoke of, as P2, a higher potentiality, a higher density. And the next level is P3. And the next one is P4. The interesting thing is not just P1, P2, P3, P4, but the transfinite process of going through P1 to P2 to P3 to P4, and the fact it is the human mind that the power of reason becomes greater and greater, the living standard becomes greater and greater. That's a scientific crash program for the United States.
Well, thank you very much. I actually I stopped to look at an article on these medical breakthroughs, which I'd sent you earlier, about whether electricity can have an effect. It seems like it is extending the lives of people with certain types of brain cancer. And I just think it reminded me of something else that Lyndon LaRouche often said, which is that you can't just rely on sense perception. That as we tend to think of the things that affect our body as those things that we can perceive with the five senses we normally use, right? Sight, hearing, smell, touch, but how do birds navigate? What is going on with the electromagnetic spectrum? Can it be the case we're living bodies that it has no effect on us, that we don't notice it? And I think this whole question of optical biophysics, questions of frequencies, questions of tuning, frequencies of living processes. What they're looking at is apparently the tumors have very specific electrical patterns, which they are looking at disrupting so that you're able to prevent the cancer from continuing to spread. It's really fascinating. And I think one of the most devastating effects of the environmentalist movement is this kind of arrogance that we already have mastered everything there is to know, and whatever appears to be waste or destructive or dirty today is going to remain so in perpetuity, ignoring the fact that almost everything today that we now consider a resource was at one time not considered useful at all. So I thought you might like to address that and perhaps put it in the context. One person here was saying, well, I don't really think we need to go to the moon. Why is that so important? So if you want to take that up, please
Sure.
go ahead.
Sure. That's great, Diane. And what you just said about, look, let's reverse it. These arrogant jerks like Fukuyama, end of history, we know everything. It's the reverse. We don't know much relative to what we can. It doesn't mean we're ignorant fools, although we could make a good case for certain people we know in the political realm. But it means that we what are we going to discover? If I could just have the last thing, I just wanted to show something from the very last slide that we didn't touch on, David. One, no, it's above that. Not the very, very last one, but the one that before we keep going up. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done this at this point. Okay, that one. If we do this, I just want to say that we will create between 40 and 45 million productive jobs. You want to talk about jobs, not jobs that Hillary Clinton would say, I want jobs. No, that deal with, that are part of this process and furtherance of this process. Why do we go to the moon? Why do we do anything? To learn universal physical principles in both culture and in science. We go out into space. You have to be in situ. You cannot just do everything on a computer. You have to be in there. And we have to consider, and as we already know, well, man's bones weaken and the musculature weakens in space. Well, how do we know that? We had people in space. How do we know that there's deadly radiation? Well, we know that up to a point. But you go out there, we don't know all the things that are going to happen on a rocket ship. We don't know all the things that are going to happen in an ocean. We don't know all the things that are going to even happen as we rebuild our older cities. I didn't include that as one of the 7. But look at all the port cities we have. Boston, New York, Newark, Baltimore, Charleston, Miami. Well, they have cities attached to them. The ports are falling apart, as Diane knows, and the cities are falling apart. And but how do you rebuild them? It's sometimes even easier to rebuild a new city than it is an older one. We don't know how to do that. We really don't. We don't know what's going to happen with rocket ships past a certain point. We don't know what it's going to take to actually land on Mars. Look, and also, just as an example, if we terraform, we grow food on the moon, which we should, we're also going to be using up areas that would accumulate helium-3. There's a trade-off. Is there something we need to do? How do people live? LaRouche said we should live in a city that are very much like what we're used to. It shouldn't be uncomfortable places to exist. And I just, from the paper that Diane sent me, which is a real gem, as much of what LaRouche writes, he goes through 6 different phases of what, and of course, when you need something, you don't find it, but of what, oh yes, he has 6 different phases, which, Diane recommended I read, and he says, phase 1, liftoff from Earth. Phase 2, industrialization of the moon. Phase 3, manned exploration of Mars. Manned exploration of Mars. Phase 4, built interplanetary space fleet, which he wants to have a fleet of 100 vessels. Phase 5, launch-powered flight of flotillas to Mars. Phase 6, descend to construct on Mars' surface. Now, he put this as a 40-year project in 1986. We're very far behind schedule. I mean, if we were to do it today, I don't know, what do you think, Diane? We'd probably be looking at 2060. But, I mean, do you think so?
I'm not sure. I think, something like that. Maybe 2050, maybe.
Yes. Or 2040, if we could accelerate it.
Yeah.
And have combinations and not try and disengage one nation from another. But the whole thing is, you explore. We use these things very carefully to then go at faster, to learn what are gravities like. For example, if you get to the largest moon of Jupiter, people could say, get to the largest moon of Jupiter. Well, Phobos, but it's very highly radioactive.
Moon of Mars.
Probably, yes, of Mars.
Phobos,
but then if you go to Jupiter,
yeah, okay.
You can't do that. Mars's atmosphere, by the way, is 95% carbon dioxide. You want to talk about greenhouse gases? They have greenhouse gases, and that's a whole question. We don't. If they have greenhouse gases, can you use hydrolysis to separate the gases? But if you do that, what are you doing? Because they have volcanoes. I don't think they have as many active, but they had a history of them, which, by the way, proves that CO2 comes mostly from volcanoes, as we always knew. But the thing is, what do you do for the atmosphere there? And how do you deal with that? There are proposals to get rockets, once they're outside the orbit of the Earth. You have to have a certain escape velocity. You can't do that with current rockets. But there are some proposals for using fusion. Because one of the reasons you go to Mars so slowly is you get outside the Earth's orbit, but you have a liquid fuel, and they don't have as much unless you build a rocket ship like the size of New York State. So you float for 6 to 9 months, basically. This one would use fusion, literally fusion, to get to Mars. Now, one thing I read, I just want to throw this out. We have to think, we have to talk to scientists. This whole paper is a call to scientists. Thousands and tens of thousands. Work with Lyndon LaRouche. Let's solve the problem. Some of we've discussed with you before, but we don't know. I read where someone said, and this is in a scientific paper, that we could achieve speeds with a fusion-powered rocket of 500,000 miles per hour. That's 500,000 miles per hour. Well, our closest Mars and Earth are 34 million miles. But let's take 40 million. If you're going 500,000 miles an hour, that's 1 million miles in an hour, 12 million miles a day. Well, if it's 12 million miles a day and we're 40 million miles away, that's only 3.5 to 4 days. But what happens to the compression of the materials? What happens to the compression of man, where you're trying to get one gravity, constant gravity? There are questions we simply don't know. And we can also, once we get into space, test out, as we are now doing with the newest telescope, the Webb telescope, the idiocy of the theory of the Big Bang. So you get scientists who are not stupid. I've read some papers. And then you get to them and they talk about Big Bang, and they have some crazy conception that somehow at some point a long time ago, there was a pressure which has never existed on the face of the world, couldn't. And it went pop. And then things came out organized. Well, what about having a creator for which we have proof in our musical composition and so forth? And just one last thing I know. We've got to flip how we look for science. Science is not objective. We're not standing there observing. First, we observe the abiotic, and then we observe the biotic, and then we observe man. It's the other way around. Once we know the creative principles of man, we use that to go back and look at the biotic and the abiotic. It's subjective in that sense. And we're discovering those principles because of the same principles by which we compose music. That's why we go to Mars.
Well, also, I think this question Leibniz asks, why is it this way and not otherwise? And I think this is one of the things that has been most under assault in the destruction of our culture, the destruction of the educational system, where if somebody, and because we don't produce, you don't have to be able to prove something. If you're building a bridge, it makes a very big difference whether someone meant 7 feet or 7 inches on a piece of equipment. One works, one doesn't. But in the modern era, if it really needs to be 7 inches, but someone says 7 feet, and the majority of the people say 7 feet, then the one who says 7 inches can be penalized, labeled an extremist, anti-Semitic, whatever, and a harasser. You didn't recognize that it's really 7 feet. People will have to go to safe rooms to nurse their feelings. The idea that there's not such a thing as truth. And I think Einstein, I don't have the exact quote, but my understanding is he expressed this. People accused him of being an atheist, far from it, because he said, the more that I discover, the more that I learn about the universe, the more obvious it is that there must be a creator. It's impossible otherwise that you would have this degree of perfection in a sense. And of course, we in our mere mortal existence are not perfect, but we can have in our mind a conception of perfection. And I think in a certain sense, this is also why the arts are so important, because no one will ever perform a Beethoven sonata the same way twice. but it can be beautiful. And we all know that we're not quite capable. We'll have an idea in our mind of what we want to express. And I imagine a painter and a sculptor has the same difficulty. You have an idea that you're trying to get out there, and it never comes out just exactly right. Whatever you think is right, it never quite comes there. It's like a ticklish problem. But imagine that kind of excitement about participating in the development of the universe and developing breakthroughs, particularly in transportation, the ability to move through space that allow us, in a sense, to change the configuration of the universe in as much as we're terraforming Earth or a desert.
Yep. Why do you think it is that people will go 7 inches, and if everyone says it's 7 feet, they'll go along with that? I mean, I agree with you. I think that's very prevalent. Why do you think so?
I think, we see it all over the place. We see it, unfortunately, in the political situation today, which is one thing that I've been challenged with, because I do believe if Kamala Harris had won the election, we probably wouldn't be here. We might have already had a nuclear war. It was catastrophic, couldn't be allowed to occur. Having said that, does that mean that President Trump is the epitome of perfection, the philosopher king? No. But the population has, in a sense, been very convinced by the media to be in a camp. That is, if you say anything remotely critical of something that Trump has done or express a way that it might be done better, there is such fear that you therefore are with the people running around saying hands off NATO and Social Security, as if that's you know, there's such a mass brainwashing of people, and there's such fear, and I think the social media actually enhances it, right? Where you're so afraid to have an opinion that's different than what you are made to believe is your peers' opinion. Because it's not even necessarily your peers' opinion, but a perception is created that it is their opinion, and therefore you don't want to stick out and be not normal and not fit in.
Which is interesting because I think one of the things that attracted us to Lynn is he worked the opposite way. He always oriented towards the anomaly. He always oriented the singularity. If he was presented with things, if something stuck out at him that didn't fit the perceived general assumptions of what people have, that's what he drove the process to. And that is a scientist's mind.
Right.
Because as we've shown all along, Kepler could have compromised on the 8 minutes of arc difference, which is a really tiny, tiny amount. Even, I mean, and in those days, with the precision that they had, was even, well, anyway, the thing is, that is what intrigued him to go forward. And what, that's why I think, by the way, I was trying to emphasize at the beginning, I hope it came across, but it's a method question. All the report that we had, and there's has all the many more figures and numbers and jobs created and physical things moved, but the whole thing is what you're saying about Trump. We it comes down to, we have to have a top down conception of what value is, because it's the same for other things. It doesn't mean you don't pay attention to the individual, just the opposite. You enhance and enrich the individual, but you have to have a conception. Where does value come from? It comes from moving an entire process to a higher level of development. That's value. That's the only economic value. It doesn't exist in GDP. Adam Smith is satanic. Karl Marx is, unfortunately, I know some Marxists, we know some Marxists who, were very good people morally, but he's an idiot. I mean, he doesn't get anything. So this is why this program that we're proposing, I think, is so important. If we can change people's thinking through getting them excited to something that is 2 to 3 times more powerful in every meaningful way. And that the human being begin with a power of reason, and at the end of each process, you have a higher power of reason. If that's demonstrable, and the enthusiasm that we create, that's a recovery program. And we'll have people in the right mood to build other things, including the smaller things.
Right. Exactly. And I just wanted to point out to everyone listening what we have been discussing here as an economic recovery program. And we have not once spoken of money. And then,
Yeah,
go
that's
ahead.
great. And the way you would build this, I have some ideas. Again, I'm waiting for certain people. I've gotten some good feedback on working people on our executive committee to comment. But I think this project, all these projects together, as best I can tell, is $3.5 trillion. I think you would put some of it in the budget, and you would budget out for many of these projects about 75 billion a year. So that for 7 projects is roughly $500 billion a year. Think of all the things we spend money on.
Well,
And
do
then,
remember during COVID, we gave BlackRock $2 trillion just at one of these emerge. So, I mean, this is the point where people have to, it has nothing to do with money, actually. It has to do with intent. It has everything to do with intent and nothing to do with money. It has to do with credit, but anyway.
yes, the credit, and this is the key thing. And then the other thing I would propose, you set up corporations like corporation for maglev or corporation for this, and they would function like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, issue bonds, and people would buy the bonds, and that would be a Hamiltonian way. And we might thirdly use renationalizing the Federal Reserve as a national bank, and we can do this. But you're absolutely right. What this is, and we didn't get a chance to go into this, and maybe in future we can. Lyndon LaRouche refers to free energy. What you're actually doing with credit is you're monetarizing free energy, or you're expressing it in a monetary form. It's not money. It's you're saying we have a certain amount of free energy. We want to increase its size, but increase its rate of growth such that it reorganizes our economy to self-develop, to produce an even higher rate of growth and a higher cognition of man. But we only have a certain amount. But we can make it grow plentifully. Therefore, we attach a financial cost like $3.5 trillion to mobilizing that free energy, and increasing the free energy ratio. We express it as a financial thing, but it's not financial. You're mobilizing something that exists in the economy. If we don't mobilize the free energy, then you just have a breakdown, and we'll fall below the level of existence. We won't even maintain the energy of the system. So really, when people talk about money, they should think in terms of what physically we're calling, because the money thing, Diane, is saying, put this first or put this second. It's a way of prioritizing how you deploy your free energy of an economy to make it grow faster.
Right. Great. Well, I think we have to wrap up. This has really been fun. Someone posted in the chat that they thought this was one of the best programs ever. So thank you. And I do want to encourage everybody who is listening now or will be listening later, you must be at the Schiller Institute conference next weekend, May 24th and 25th. Visit schillerinstitute.com. If you can't come in person, it is in the New York City metropolitan area. If you can't come in person, you can watch online. Everyone knows you miss a great deal by not being there in person, but it's better than not participating. And as always, the movement needs your financial support. So please sign up at thelarouche.org. If you sign up for a monthly donation of any amount of $10 or more, you also get our daily and weekly intelligence service, for which Richard Freeman writes, as do I, less frequently than you perhaps, but so you can do that. So thank you very much. And next week will be the eve of this amazing conference, and I hope to see everyone there.
Same thing. I hope to see everyone there.
Yes, great.